Care2, it's Heather, and I'm coming to you from Care2 HQ here in Washington, D.C., with sort of our take on day 2 of the Republican convention. Obviously, day 1 of the Republican convention was cut short by the arrival of Hurricane Gustav as it battered the Gulf Coast down Louisiana and Mississippi. You can sort of see the aftermath of that. All of the governors in that area who are Republicans are not, in fact, attending the convention. They're staying around. So what's going on tonight at the Republican convention? Well, as I mentioned, they are proceeding, but they have sort of scrapped their initial program. And we mentioned yesterday that even though Senator Joe Lieberman was scheduled to be speaking last night, that we suspect that he might be showing up later in the week if they could squeeze him in. And in fact, that is what is happening. Senator Lieberman is set to be talking tonight to delegates as with a speech entitled "The Original Maverick." So you can see my little air quotes there. So we'll sort of see how that plays out. Obviously, Lieberman is someone who is sort of left the Democratic Party. He's now technically an independent Democrat. So those are sort of the kinds of things we're seeing. The interesting sort of who we're not seeing, this is the second day we've been talking about this, we are not going to see Rudy Giuliani. Rudy Giuliani was actually set to give the keynote this evening, and he is not speaking tonight at all. Which is a little bit curious. They are talking about maybe slotting him in a little bit later in the week, but I think it's really interesting that they bumped him since he's supposed to be the keynoter for the entire convention. And the other person who they're sort of being cagey about right now is President Bush himself, who is not going to appear in person at this point, but he may appear via satellite to the delegates. And as we talked about yesterday, President Bush is definitely, they're trying to sort of have a little bit of a firewall between a president whose approval ratings are below 30% and McCain, the presumptive nominee for the party. So that's sort of what's going on inside the hall. We wanted to talk a little bit about the presumptive Republican vice presidential nominee, Sarah Palin. Now, we sort of gave you a little bit of an intro for her yesterday, but there's a lot that's been coming out in the last 2 or 3 days since her selection was announced. And it's all sort of very interesting. Many people, of course, the first thing that jumps to mind at this point is that it was announced yesterday that her 17-year-old daughter is 5 months pregnant and expecting a child at the end of this year, beginning of next year. But what I think is more interesting is a lot of what's coming out about her record and about the McCain campaign's, frankly, lack of vetting of her. She has been presented, and really her primary credential is she's an outsider, not from Washington, a big reformer who supports Senator McCain on, not supporting earmarks, et cetera, not supporting the so-called bridge to nowhere that had been promoted by her former patron, frankly, Ted Stevens. She used to actually run a 527, which is sort of a political organization for him. But as it turns out, the story is they said they wanted to build me this bridge to nowhere. I said thanks, but no thanks. But that's not quite true. As it turns out, when she was running for governor just 2 years ago, she, in fact, supported the so-called bridge to nowhere, and only after the fact did she sort of change her position on it. It was also revealed that while she was mayor of Wasilla, that small town in Alaska, she actually had hired a lobbyist, one of 6 incorporated towns in the entire state of Alaska, that had a registered lobbyist working on its behalf to bring back millions of dollars in earmarks. So you can start to see some potential chinks in the sort of reformer image that the party has tried to build for her on that. That's been happening. And the other piece of information that's really potentially damaging is that, back in the 90s, she was a member of a political party in Alaska called the Alaska Independence Party, not to be confused with the Alaska Independent Party. The Alaska Independence Party supports secession, that Alaska would secede from the Union. And in fact, their catchphrase is Alaska First, which is maybe a little bit uncomfortably close to Country First, which is the overarching theme at this point of the McCain campaign. So we want to wrap up sort of our discussion of Palin by really talking about what's the overarching piece, because fundamentally this is really about John McCain. Well, what's happened is the New York Times actually published today a huge story about the vetting process that happened with Governor Palin, and essentially how cursory it was. McCain only sent his team in on Thursday, which was the day before he announced his pick. You've already heard that he'd only met Governor Palin once in person and then talked to her on the phone a second time before meeting her to actually offer her the job. And now we're seeing all these stories that we've just talked about in terms of what her actual record is versus what they've sort of been promoting. And it really all adds up to a broader question that now is starting to be asked about McCain's judgment in this, whether this was a rash, irrational decision. And the last thing we wanted to follow up on, because it's really quite disturbing, is what's going on with the protests in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Over 50 people have been arrested at this point, and there were some protests in Denver, and people were arrested in Denver. There were over 100 arrests made in Denver. However, in this case, these are preemptive police raids where you had informants who were within some of these protest organizations that were planning stuff, and they've preemptively gone in, arrested these folks. Some of it's getting ugly. There's been pepper spray used on the streets in Minneapolis to try to break up some of these protesters as well, and you even had journalists arrested. We had several incidents yesterday. Amy Goodman had reported on it, but as it turned out, Amy Goodman herself was detained for several hours, as were two of her producers, and some of our friends over at the Uptake who have been reporting this. They weren't even really arrested. They were sort of just taken into custody for a couple hours, never charged with anything, and released. So we're going to continue to be following that. It's really quite scary. Our blogger Catherine did a great piece on this just this morning, and so I encourage you to read that. There's a lot of great video footage, if disturbing, that shows what's been going on there in Minneapolis. So I hope you'll continue to watch our coverage. Give us your feedback and comments. How do you think the Republican convention is going? Things are going to get going into prime time around 8 o'clock Eastern, as they always do, but you can always be watching it on the cables and probably C-SPAN if you want to see it unvarnished without the media sort of talking over the top of those speakers. So that's it for now from Care2, and we will see you soon.